Hello, I am Mariko Tamaki, and I am elated to welcome you to the 2021 Brooklyn Book Festival for a conversation today with Hiromi Goto, Julia Kaye, and Kristen Radka. Reminder that there are captions for this event, but you need to enable them if you want captions. Before we begin, I want to let you know that books by the authors in this program can all be purchased in the link below, so there should be a link there. And you should purchase them there or at your local bookstore because supporting local bookstores is awesome. So joining me today, so first we have Hiromi Goto. Hiromi Goto is an immigrant from Japan who gratefully lives on the unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories. She's written Chorus of Mushrooms, The Kappa Child, along with several novels for children and youth, a book of poetry, and a collection of short stories. Shadow Life is her latest novel and her first graphic novel with illustrator Anne Chu. So hello Hiromi. Lee Lai is an Australian cartoonist and illustrator living in the Chukchoge, which is Montreal, Quebec, to some people. Her new graphic novel, Stone Fruit, is an exhilarating and tender debut, an ode to the love and connection shared among three women and the child they all adore. Julia Kaye is an award-winning artist and illustrator whose webcomic Up and Out has garnered hundreds of thousands of readers worldwide and wide critical acclaim. Her commitment to activism has led to collaborations with nonprofit organizations such as the Trevor Project and Trans Lifeline. She's best known for her 2018 comic memoir, Super Late Bloomer, My Early Days in Transition, which the Beat listed as one of, oh my gosh, sorry, that's really loud. Which the Beat listed as one of the 100 best comics of the decade. The sequel, My Life in Transition, a Super Late Bloomer collection, came out earlier this year to wide critical praise. Julia lives in Los Angeles. So Julia's very lucky to live in Los Angeles, obviously. Kristen Radka is the author of graphic novel nonfiction book CQ and Imagine Wanting Only This, the recipient of the 2019 Whiting Creative Nonfiction Grant. She is the art director of The Verge as of very recently, yes? Yes, congratulations. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Marie Claire, The Atlantic, The Guardian, GQ, Vogue, and Oxford American, among many other publications. So thank you to everybody who is here. I have read all of your works. I am a huge fan, and I am very excited to talk to everybody today. So thank you. Okay, I am a little sweaty, so apologies for that. Okay, so first question is for Hiromi. Your publishing history is, well, you have a very broad publishing history, and it's incredibly rich with stories that combine a kind of whimsical fairy tale folk world with very tough, very true to life protagonists. I feel like they're very Canadian protagonists, which we can talk about more. But I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the hero of Shadow Life, Kamiko Saito, and what inspired you to tell her story.
Well, Kamiko is a 76-year-old Japanese Canadian elder who is on the lam from her supported housing residence because she just wanted to have her own independent life on her own terms. So she hightails it out and keeping her new location secret from her adult daughters, and basically a badass. My very first novel was about very much about an older Japanese Canadian character. And I always return to these older women, probably because I had a very strong relationship with my own grandmother. But in Shadow Life, I was very excited about having her physical representation visible on the page, which is entirely different experience of relationship to image and identity and story, as opposed to the novels I'd written before, which is, you carry those images inside your mind and your heart mind while you're reading text. But with a graphic novel. It's graphic. So that's a totally different kind of relationship. And I just really love the idea of having all these pages of this glorious older woman living her life, and being a fatter woman and older and naked and just really real.
Yeah, I mean, you get to see her, yeah, in all states. And I think Anne did such a great job of really showing this kind of mix of frailty and toughness. Like that you're afraid for her a little bit, but then you also get to see her be this such a resilient force, kind of like huffing along the sidewalk. And you're just like praying she doesn't fall. No, I mean, I think that there is, and I think that the thing that I think is interesting that kind of combines the similarity between your books and these books is they're both about these, these familial relationships, these kind of complicated, kind of having it out, not necessarily having it out, fraught conflicts between generations. And I think that it's interesting, they're both, like if you wanted to do a study of like sort of various forms of kind of passive aggression, they're kind of like very interesting studies of passive aggression, like how that plays out amongst different kinds of families. And I was wondering, Lee, if you could tell us, because your story also, it is this sort of like the multiple people who are connected by this little girl that they all sort of love and are sort of surrounding her and sort of part of her family in different ways. And I was wondering if you could tell us about sort of whose story you had first. Like, was it that you sort of had the little girl and you sort of built out from there? Or was it like, what was the sort of origin of the story of Storm Fruit?
Sure. I mean, I started writing it as little vignettes, as I tend to do with larger projects. Like I had a real craving to process my own feelings about parenting, as someone who cannot and probably never will carry a child. And so I was thinking about like biological power dynamics in queer relationships, and also like the kinds of relationships that queer aunties can have, because I think I just have great aspirations to be an auntie to as many children as possible, but never be like never be an actual parent. And so it started with just a lot of play scenes that I was doing between two queer aunts. One of them is biologically related to the kid and one of them is not. One of them is trans also, but that's like, it depends on who's reading it as to how important that is in the story, I think. And they're just having a bunch of fun with the kid. And I think one of the big things in the story that I came up against when I started building the character of Amanda, who's the kid's mum, was that the queer aunties can access a kind of play and magic and fun with that kid that the mother doesn't get to access because she's dealing with the day-to-day dirt. And so trying to look at the differences and the jealousy that both sides experience of the other around legitimacy, and then also around like fun and novelty. And then the story kind of ran away from me as I got more interested in all of the characters, and it split off in different directions and kind of came about everyone equally. I think it depends on the reader as to which relationships take the priority in the story.
Well, yeah, I think it is very much a situation where you have a lot of sort of shifting alliances in the book as you sort of see different people acting different ways as the book goes along. So that's interesting. So you started off with, was it that you had these vignettes in terms of creating the character? Like, did any of those vignettes make it whole hog into the final book? Or was it sort of a matter of developing in one place and then moving into sort of a larger story?
Definitely none of the initial vignettes made it into the book because I was changing so much in my drawing style as I was going along, and it was my first graphic novel, so the learning curve was very steep. And so every time I finished 3 pages, I'd learned so much in those 3 pages that I was like, yes, time to redraw, which was excruciating, but probably quite important. I see a lot of nodding.
I do think it is. I think it is an open secret, the physical labor that goes into creating a graphic novel, which is why everybody knows that the one thing you don't ever say to somebody after reading their graphic novel is you don't ever tell them how long it took you to read it. because nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to spend 3 years of their life making something that you read in 40 minutes. Nobody cares that you read in 40 minutes. It's not a race.
But people say it like a compliment. People are like, I read your book in an hour.
Yes. I once sat at a book launch for a comic book, watching a bunch of little kids finishing the book. And so by the time from kids arriving to the author going on the stage, they'd all finished the book. And they all screamed that they had finished the book when the author got on stage. And I just thought, that's rude. That's what I thought.
Compliment also. Like, I love to hear that someone's read my book in an hour. Like, I'm a big fan of the reread, for one thing. If something has impacted me, I can read it in an hour and then want to read it again in an hour.
Yes.
But as someone with a very short attention span, if someone has read it in an hour, it is a compliment to me that I held their attention for that much time.
Yeah, I think all of these books are books also that are, as someone who has done this, I think that you actually get different things out of, because I think the level of story and then the level that art is working with the story is so much a part of what you're reading in a graphic novel, which is actually really perfect for CQ, because I do feel like I read CQ once just for as an investigation of loneliness and to learn as much about loneliness as humanly possible. And then I was sad and lonely, and then I went back and I also looked at the illustrations and just how visceral they are. And I think that you could almost just I think that you could just sit and absorb those. And there's moments when I felt like there's so many moments in CQ where people's backs are turned to you. And I was just like, I can't even look at this right now. It's just too much for me. And I was thinking, it is hard to imagine that anybody, first of all, I had to ask you if you ever watched the movie The Lonely Guy with Steve Martin.
No.
Okay,
Yeah.
so that's not that you don't, that you need to, but it's an interesting partner with this book, because it's about lonely guys and about a book. Steve Martin writes a book about lonely guys. But it is possible that people were interested in loneliness before 2020. But I was wondering if you could, if the origins of this book, was it, I guess it's hard not to imagine a person sitting in the pandemic world and thinking I should write about loneliness. But was this something that you were interested in when everybody else was suddenly overwhelmed with the reality of loneliness?
Yeah, when I sold the book to my publisher, the pitch was sort of loneliness is the thing that everybody feels but nobody talks about, because it is I feel like we've made strides on destigmatizing depression, mental health, but loneliness pre-pandemic, not, it felt like sort of like a personal shame or like a failing if you were lonely.
Right.
But what I wanted to investigate in the book is deep-seated American ideologies that isolate us from one another. And I started writing it in 2016, a lonely year for a lot of people in America. I was also in my late 20s at the time, and through researching the book, learned later that loneliness spikes at 3 ages, and one of those ages is your late 20s. So I was statistically, I guess, in a moment. But I was really finishing the book. I think I was doing copy edits when the pandemic hit, and that was a very strange experience. But I do think it's when I talk about loneliness, it's important to separate the loneliness of the pandemic, which is a sort of situational experience, from chronic loneliness that people experience for decades or generations.
Right. I think it's it's one of the themes of this whole panel, obviously, is this idea of the personal and the universal. And I think that it is an important part of this book, that it's not about loneliness as just a concept. It's also about you feeling lonely, and bringing yourself into the book was obviously, because it is obviously it is possible even with illustrations to make something feel sort of more textbook distant, but you really do pull the reader into your experience in this book. And I guess so that was a conscious choice as well, as part of I would imagine as part of the vulnerability.
I don't know. It's a good question. I will say that, and on early drafts, when I had a trusted reader read it, they were like, where are you in this book? And I was just very fascinated with like the science of loneliness, with finding loneliness in pop culture and the way that we talk about it, the way that we talk about, you know, loneliness surrounding violence and things like that. And I was just like, all I wanted to do was investigate those facts. And then over time, I kind of came around to me being a bigger part of it, because I think a reader sometimes needs like a personal guide. But I think with nonfiction too, it's like hard to even tell sometimes, particularly when you're like investigating and reporting and researching, to decide like when you're going to come in, because similar to what Lee said, everything kind of starts in these little bits and pieces, and then they start like growing and like creating these webs, and all these things you didn't even realize were connected to one another are so linked. And I think that's actually the real pleasure of writing and drawing nonfiction, is like these things sort of appear in front of you that you thought were like one thing was here and one thing was here, but they're actually, you know, like this.
Yeah, and I think that comics has a kind of interesting sort of extended history with that now. Like if you look at like people like Alison Bechdel, how their works really combine, like, you know, the Are You My Mother is really like half, I'm going to just like look at this thing, which is a textbook, even like there's even pages on the page where she's just like, this is something else. And then there's this like levels of vulnerability. And I think comics is a great medium for sort of watching that kind of play out, the sort of personal and also the theoretical or the sort of academic or what have you. Yeah,
especially because you can literally show that, like you can visibly show that process of learning and receiving information, like the textbook example in Bechdel, for example.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I think it's interesting. So for to move into talking about my life in transition, I was going to say my life in translation. Was, I think that it's, I mean, you're so vulnerable in that book. And I think it is just the beauty of these moments that are, because I think that kind of like 4-panel format can go so much for like, just for like straight humor. And you do such a great job of mixing the vulnerability of what you're talking about with things that are obviously very funny. And I was wondering, what drew you to the format of diary comics, or do you think of them as diary comics for your work? I mean, did you think like, this is the way that I'm going to talk about this? Like, this is just the way this makes sense to me to document this part of my life in this format? Or did it just sort of start happening and then you were like, oh, this is how I'm going to tell what's happening in my life right now?
Well, I guess that's a multi-part question.
Yes, it is a multi-part question.
It kind of arose out of necessity. Well, I mean, first off, as far as the format's concerned, I grew up on newspaper comics and they were really instrumental to me. Well, actually, hold on. Let's put a pin on that. It came out of necessity. I was already a working cartoonist, making gag strips, doing like little like maybe anywhere between 3 and 6 panel comics for the internet, gag like absurdist humor sort of stuff. And so I was used to the beats of a short form comic and storytelling where you end on a punchline. But I was going through obviously a very intense emotional experience when I first started transitioning, and I didn't know how to talk about it with anyone. And so turning to comics where like I didn't have to tell, like making them just for myself, where I didn't necessarily have to tell a joke at the end, where like the punchline could just be like an emotional punch. Just felt really good. Like I didn't know how to talk about it with anybody in my life. Everybody was ostensibly cis at the time anyway. And so yeah, I was just it just started really as a journal, because I've never been good at keeping a written journal. And so a mix of, you know, what I was already doing, making comics, it just seemed a natural fit for me to turn to making journal comics exclusively for myself, with maybe the idea of putting them out into the world one day if I was ever felt like I was in a position to do so. But the format really came out of necessity, because I needed something short, like that I could like step away from the internet, step away from everything, kind of just think about my day and figure out what affected me emotionally really intensely. Like what was something I really wanted to meditate on for a while. And that ended up just being like just enough to fit into a 3-panel comic, which I didn't want the project to feel too big for me to not be able to continue it, because it was really just art therapy for me when it first started. And so by making it really small and manageable, it just seemed to make sense. And then I was already like fixated on newspaper comics growing up, so I understood the medium, and I really had an adoration of it. And then in retrospect, I do think that there's something really powerful about the medium, being able to check in on characters on a daily basis, go back again and again and again, and you end up with like this series of micro vignettes, being able to tell like really nuanced small moments that you wouldn't be able to otherwise, that when pieced together weave into a tapestry of something much larger. I'm just fascinated with the format.
I mean, the format it's so deceptively difficult to put things into 4 panels. Like, it's just like such a, I mean, I think people underestimate like how much of comics is about pacing. I think people think of it as sort of like art and words, but really what words and where and how many panels, and like, you know, a page is like how you think of a page or how you think of like a strip, or all of those things are really, I could write strips. I'm such a huge fan of that format. And every time I tried to do it, it feels like a sentence. And so I've stopped trying to do it. But I really, I admire that approach. Yeah, it's amazing. And I do think it's like this, you know, I mean, now you have them in terms of how you release them. Do you only release them in collections, or how do you put them out on your website in sort of segments?
Well, when I made them, the first book, Super Late Bloomer, came about because I was slowly putting them online one by one, and then when I got a book deal, it was really important for me to have a clause in there that I could release basically the entire book online, because it's super important for me to create queer representative media and like not have it behind any sort of paywall. I mean, like, the collection is fantastic. I think it's best suited in book form, but like, it's super, it's most of the first, like, both books are online exclusively, specifically so I could reach younger people, specifically like where they are on social media.
Yes, that is where they are for sure. So Hiromi, this is your first graphic novel. You've worked with illustrators before, though, because you've worked with illustrators, I mean, in as much as you've had illustrators who've done book covers for you in the past, but this is obviously very different. And I was wondering, what was it like sharing the storytelling process, especially something that is personal, because everybody else here is writer illustrator, and you are writer, works with illustrator. So what was it like sharing the creation process with another artist? And are there ways that you think that benefited the story that you were telling?
Well, first of all, I can't say enough about artist Anne Zhu's brilliant interpretation of the narrative. It's, she just completely captured the spirit of Kamiko in this marvelous way. And I feel inadequate here because everyone's an artist, and I just looking at how many drafts she had to go through, I just feel like I'm not worthy. So it's so much, like, it's not just the skill and the imagination, but it's just actually outright labor, so much labor that it's unbelievable. So I think artists who do that work earn every bit of the royalties they get, and they should get more. In my mind, it's just so much work. But in terms of I approached the writing of the manuscript. I thought, I read graphic novels, and further back I read a lot of manga, so that sort of that sense of visual storytelling is something I was familiar with, but not in a written form. So I kind of, when I write novels anyway, I find it very visual. It's like I see sort of movie inside my head, or just shots in my head, which I translate into words for a novel. So I kind of approached it like it was a sort of a screenplay. Not that I've written screenplays either, but this is what I kind of imagined it would be kind of like. And it was, I felt a little bit trepidatious handing it over, because it's such a internally visual experience to write this story, that I have ideas of things like vantage point angles, lighting, all these things going on. And then you hand the manuscript over, and then of course you can hand the same story to someone, they see it in a different way. But then at first I felt a little bit, like possessive. But once I could let that go, it was just amazing, because then it was like I got to tap into another very close to the original, but a different way of seeing something. And that's just so amazing. I really loved that experience. It was just, it was a privilege to go through that process.
Yeah, it's such a privileged feeling to have somebody to draw a story that you have written. I think it never feels not magical to have it happen. It's like, it's a drawing now. I think it always feels great. But was there things that she interpreted? I mean, because I know that this has happened to me. Were there things that she interpreted in ways that you were surprised by, or were there moments that she found that you were surprised by?
It was more like it was more like I learned a lot through what Anne did with the manuscript. So I would have these odd details, like she nodded, and it's like, like how many times is someone going to visually nod in a graphic novel? It just doesn't make sense, right? It's like, oh yeah, doy. And then I felt like I learned all kinds of things from seeing what the text became on paper, and then the decisions she made. Sometimes I would focus in on certain things, but then if she would interpret that, and then she would convey those things. So it was just fascinating.
Right. Yes, I think it is a lesson in like what you can and cannot draw. It was like one of the first things I realized is like someone walking out the door is not necessarily a great panel description. It's like the art of walking out the door is not necessarily looks good, doesn't look good. So one of the things that I they're very different books in many ways, but I think that there's a lot of parallels between Stone Fruit and between Shadow Life. Both of them are actually, I think, well, probably Bustiku too, like the sort of element of fantasy, the sort of element of unreality in stories that feel very realistic. And I was thinking for Lee that there really is this element of fantasy. I mean, this element, like the element of fantasy in Stone Fruit is very specific. It's like when they're playing, then you have this world transform, and you actually, because it's a graphic novel, get to see it transform. And I was wondering, and I think that the element of fantasy is a very common one that you see in graphic novels and like sort of heartfelt stories, that because you can have things sort of magically happen that they do. And I was wondering what you think the element of fantasy brings to a story that's otherwise, it's pretty emotionally intense, right? Like there's things that are happening in Stone Fruit that are like painful and hard to watch. And at the same time, it's this moment where things can be magical. And I was wondering why you wanted to use that element of magic in this story.
I mean, I just have to say first off that it's a huge compliment to me that there's any parallels between Shadow Life and Stone Fruit, because I loved your book, Hiromi. It was such a treat to read. I think for me, sorry, there's a plane going overhead. Do I have to shout above it, or is it okay?
I can hear you. I think we can hear you.
Like the fantasy element was something I really wanted to do, but it was definitely something that I was inserting in order to push myself. My comics are generally pretty rooted in realism, and it was pretty anti-intuitive to me actually to have those play scenes in there where they morph into kind of monsters. But it was very fun, and it was a chance for me to get a bit looser with my drawing style, which is often pretty tight. And so it was, yeah, I put it in there as a way to challenge myself. But also, yeah, entirely what you said, Mariko, like just to have some levity in the story. Like it's a pretty,
Right.
it's a bit of a downer story. Like it's, the story follows a breakup, a romantic breakup, and what happens to their lives as the story splits into what they both deal with from there. And then it's a lot of stuff about estranged siblings and difficult family relationships. And I hope there's a little bit of humor in there. I guess it depends on who's reading it. But the play was a chance to kind of have this sense of levity and escapism, and also then to see how that rebounds on the rest of the story. I mean, there's a bit where Bron is overusing that escapism to the point where she isn't really dealing with reality as she should be.
Right. Yeah, I do think it's I think that especially Stone Fruit is a book that I think will be read very differently by parents and people who are not parents.
Mm-hmm.
I think aunties and parents would probably read that book very differently. Maybe the empathy would be in different places depending. And actually, I think too, CQ is a book that, like, I wondered if there are pages that feel very, we talked a little bit earlier about the sort of benefits of sort of nonfiction or like what nonfiction or what graphic novel formats bring to nonfiction writing. There's pages of CQ that are sort of much more A to A in terms of what you're describing and what you're showing. And then there are pages that are really just about, like, really just metaphor, right? Like the feeling of drowning, the feeling of being lost, as opposed to just sort of seeing things that are sort of, depicting historical events or things that you're describing. And I was wondering, do you think that is the same thing? Is that there's some kind of like, do you think it's about sort of having like moments of like a sort of lightness or something else other than, like, do you think about it in terms of tone, or do you think about it in terms of just giving the reader sort of a moment of pause as you're sort of shifting between these different kinds of images?
I mean, I think it's mostly about feeling for me. But this book is different from my last book and from projects I've done before in that it's not sequential, it's not in panels. It's like just like kind of organic image shapes of, and images kind of bleed into each other, which was like very freeing because I didn't have to make characters, and I just wanted to like show information. But one of the challenges was then it's like, okay, how do I not keep drawing like a person alone in an empty room about loneliness? It's like
another sad
I don't
person.
know. Yeah, totally. It's like there's, and then you said like people from their backs. I'm like, yeah, I know, I did that a lot. But I think there's thanks, but I don't know. I mean, I'm always very curious to hear how other artists make their work because I have a lot of friends who work sequentially, who work from panel 1 to panel 1000 at the end of the book, and they do it all in order. And that's just never how I work, because when I sit down to work in the morning, it's just like, what can I get done today? Like, what can I do in this time before I have to, move to my day job? So it's like, how can I just get something on the page? So it's usually like, I know what I want this page to do and to be. So then like the book gets more and more filled as I go after I'm at the stage where I understand kind of sort of the structure of it. But then there are like all of these drawings, it's like by the last bit of it, there'll be like, the 30 drawings that are the hardest drawings to make, because I just really don't know how I can best communicate on those pages. But I think like slowly it feels impossible, and then you get an idea or something makes sense to you.
Yeah, I think the fascinating thing about comic making is that there are so many different ways to do it, especially as like a larger project, like as you sort of work between, like if people who work from scripts, people who don't write scripts, people who, really thumbnail onto the scripts directly, and then, or, like people who go, like even people who in the sort of final inks go randomly from page to page as opposed to sequentially. Like it really is such a I mean, it's, I think it's a reflection of the artist as opposed to being like an actual, you know, set in stone process.
Yeah.
Which I think, you know, like makes for such different graphic novels and makes for such different works, which I think is also really interesting.
Yeah, and I also think it's important for artists to recognize that, because I feel like when I was just starting, I felt like if I heard someone talk about their process and it wasn't how I worked, it felt like I was doing something wrong, or like I was never going to be an artist or a writer. And so I
Right.
just like, there's so many ways to make something,
Oh
and you just
yeah.
have to find the way that works for you, and it doesn't have to look like how somebody else does it.
Yeah. If you ever go to a party and somebody tells you that this is the way that this is done, that person is wrong, because there's
Yeah.
never one way to do something. It's like someone told me once, it's like you have to write every day. And I was like, it's good if you write every day. You don't
Yeah.
have to write every day. You can do whatever you want. You can do it all in like 1 week, and like you can take the rest of the month and just like watch Great British Bake Off if you want to. Like,
But
all of
also,
those
like, I
things are
hate
possible.
it when people say stuff like that, because I also feel like it's like this horribly like classist, elitist thing to say, that like to assume that every artist is able to make time in their, like, with family and work obligations and whatever else other good obligations they have to write or to draw every day. I mean, it's like you have to just make time where you can make time.
Sure, for sure. Actually, so I was curious, Julia, so because that you are, I feel like sort of unlike sort of a, I hate the word traditional, unlike one kind of graphic novel, which is the thing that gets scripted entirely as one thing and then goes through this very sort of behind the curtains process where you're like, you know, and then you sort of show it to the world. You, because you're sharing it, or, you know, because you have, I would imagine, more feedback from people because you're sharing on the internet various panels or various pages and stories as they come out. Do you feel the influence of, because you have sort of more feedback, or you're able to see more feedback from people?
No. I very intentionally, when it's making the two projects that became a Super Late Bloomer, My Life in Transition, I intentionally stepped away from the internet to because I know, like, having put my work online and worked as, you know, making gag strips and whatever, like the instant feedback can be really you know, get that dopamine rush. It's an incredible thing and really nerve-wracking, but also like I end up intentionally making work that influences me to a certain extent. And for my ability to be raw and honest, you know, which was my intention with Super Late Bloomer, was kind of a, I'm not gonna say an accident, but like that kind of just came out of necessity. With My Life in Transition, I was like, I'm gonna do that again with intention. I needed to step away to be as honest as possible, because, you know, otherwise I would find myself avoiding certain topic, or like I could foresee myself avoiding certain topics and being reluctant to talk about certain hurts or certain things that I could later choose whether I felt comfortable sharing or not.
Right. Well, I do think there can be a pressure, especially when you are saying something that is significant to a community, right? This desire to have this thing, which is like, on the one hand, I do think people want things to be sort of personal and honest. On the other hand, I think that there can be like a level of like, well, we also want to feel connected to it. We want to feel like it's for us. And so we want you to be personal and honest, but in a way that feels connected to us. And that can be like a sort of layer of feedback that I can imagine is.
Oh, exactly. And like it could feel it feels very easy, being the way that most social media platforms are set up to be geared towards showing, like, putting your best foot forward, showing like just the highlights, to smoothing over certain bumps to make it seem like things aren't quite as bad, to, you know, insert a level of being more saccharine than it deserves to be. Because like social media platforms generally aren't set up to deal with like small doses of, oh yeah, I was not feeling great this day. Like that sort of thing generally doesn't go super viral, you know?
Right. Well, like the sentiment of I hate this, or the sentiment of like this sucks and I don't want to do this, is not necessarily like a super like thing, but it's also part of the story. And I think that, you know, the thing I love about My Life in Transition is it really feels like you're like, this is all of it. This is all of the little bits of the story. These are like little parts of me crying on the couch. And here's other parts that are like more things are happening, but also I'm back crying on the couch now just because that's where it is.
That's
very
sometimes
appreciated
it
that.
goes.
Excellent. Okay, so I want to make sure everybody has a chance to say where people can find you, not like obviously addresses, but like where people can find you making stuff that you are sharing. And if you have other upcoming things, or maybe we could talk about where people can find you and what your next project that you have coming up is. Can we start with Lee? Because you're in my top corner.
Okay, I am not very good at social media, so I tend to just stick to one thing, which is Instagram. Although I do check my emails very often, and my email address is in my Instagram. My Instagram is _ Lee Lai. And the next thing I'm working on is another graphic novel called Canon. I'm deliberately taking as long as possible because I keep changing my mind about elements of the story, so it probably won't be out for another couple of years. But I post little bits of it online.
Oh, good. Excellent. Hiromi?
Active on Twitter and Instagram. My Twitter account is at Hinganai, which is means vulgar in Japanese. And it was a joke towards my mom who will never see it. So all very obscure, but I'm on Twitter and also Instagram at Hiromi Goto Writes. So, but I tend to post a lot of photographs and thoughts about the non-human world, plants, fungi, animals, everyone. And that's my next book project that I'm working on currently. So,
yes, I am obsessed with Hiromi's Instagram. Let's just say that. I am obsessed with the idea that you just eat mushrooms that you find in the ground. And that's okay.
Not all mushrooms, not all of them.
No, but that you even do that even just once. It's very scary to me, but I think it's very cool. Julia.
I am on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok now, I guess, at Up and Out Comic. I guess one word. And honestly, I'm putting out little bits and bops every now and then as I feel it, but I'm not actually, don't have any projects to announce. Kind of just hit a good point in like, as far as my life is concerned with transition related stuff and just kind of vibing and enjoying life. So that's nice.
Excellent. Kristen.
I'm on Twitter, Kristen just says Kristen Radtke, and my Instagram, Kristen Radtke _ and KristenRadtke.com. And my next book is about gossip.
Oh. Love that. That's amazing. I used to be obsessed with small talk, the way people talked, and I studied linguistic anthropology.
We should talk about it.
We should definitely talk about that at some
to.
point. Oh my gosh. Okay. So now I'm going to say the ending blurb, which they gave me, and I have 4 minutes left to do that. And I'm pretty excited about that. Okay. Thank you. I want to thank everybody in this panel who were amazing, as I knew they would be. Please remember that you can order books in the link below, and please consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which this year is celebrating its 16th year of presenting free literary programming. I want to thank also Joan Hilty, who was like, you should do this. And I'm really glad that she said that because it was really fun. So thank you very much, everybody. And go buy books, go see more Brooklyn Book Festival things. And that's it. That's the end of the day. So thank you very much. I think we all just like leave. I think that's what we're supposed to do.
Thank you so much, Mariko, for moderating. You did a beautiful job. It was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.